What I'd like to ask you is that looking at the future, have the business practices of the investment banks become so complex that it is not possible for the head of the investment bank to be aware of the exposures to financial risks day to day or week to week?
Yeah, that's an exceptionally good question. And I think the answer probably is yes, at least in some places. Although there's a few investment bank heads I've got enormous respect for their ability to sort of get their minds around risk. But I decided, for example, when we bought Gen Re, it had about 23,000 derivative contracts. And I think I could have spent full time on that and not really been able to get my mind around how much risk we were running under some fairly extreme conditions that I did not think were impossible, but that the people who are running the operation might have thought were impossible, or that might not have cared about it that much because their own incentive compensation was such that if they made a lot of money one year on something that would work 99 years out of 100, they would feel the chances of something going wrong big were very slim. But I don't want to have it slim, I want to have it none. So I regard myself as the chief risk officer at Berkshire. If something goes wrong at Berkshire in terms of risk of the way we run the place, there's no way I can assign that to a risk committee or have some mathematicians come in and make a bunch of calculations and tell me that I'm only running a risk that'll happen once in the history of the universe or something of the sort. I think the big investment banks, a number of them, and big commercial banks, I think they're almost too big to manage effectively from a risk standpoint in the way they've elected to conduct their business. And it's going to work most of the time. So you don't see the risk in a way that, I mean, if you have a 1 in 50-year risk that a place will go broke, it may not be in the interest of a 62-year-old executive that's going to retire at 65 to worry too much about that. I worry about everything at Berkshire. So I would say they're very hard to manage, very hard to have your mind around. I mean, clearly, you've seen cases in the last year where very big institutions, if the CEO knew what was going on, he certainly hasn't admitted it subsequent to what's happened, because it's embarrassing either way, but it's less embarrassing to say I didn't know what was going on than to acknowledge that you knew these kind of activities were going on and you let them go on. I've been asked for advice on regulation sometimes, and we have seen an extraordinary example, which somehow the press really hasn't picked up on much. But you had an organization called OFEO, whose sole job was to supervise two big companies, and these big companies were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they had a large element of public purpose in them, and they were chartered by the federal government, and their activities had overtones for the whole mortgage and securities markets. So Congress said, if we're going to give you all this too big to fail type protection in terms of the federal government stepping in and give you special privileges, we want to keep an eye on you. So they formed OFEO, and they had 200 people going to work, I presume at 9 at 5, and their sole job was to see what these two places were doing. And they turned out to be two of the biggest accounting misrepresentations in the history of the world. So they were 2 for 2 with the only things they had to examine. And I fear that if you tried to do the same thing with the biggest commercial banks or the biggest investment banks, I'm not sure you can keep track of it. What you need is somebody at the top whose DNA is very, very much programmed against risk, and he is going to have to resist the entreaties of those who work beneath him, who say everybody else is doing it, and if they can do it over there and make all this money doing it, why can't we be doing it here? And that's not easy to do. I mean, when you got a bunch of high-powered people who are used to making in 7 figures every year, and they want to do things, and they say, if you don't do them here, we're going to go elsewhere. It's a very tough system to beat. So I would say that in many ways, there are firms that, in terms of risk, simply they are conducting themselves in a way that they're too big to manage. And if at the same time the government says they're too big to fail, that has some very interesting policy implications. Charlie?
Well, I would argue that you say that very well. It does have interesting policy implications. It's crazy to have people get so big and so important that you can't allow them to fail and allow them to be run with as much knavery and stupidity as permeated the major investment banks. It's not that Berkshire hasn't had wonderful service from investment banking all these years, because we have. It's just that as an industry, this crazy culture of greed and overreaching and overconfidence in trading algorithms and so on creeps in, and I would argue it's quite counterproductive for the country, and it ought to be reined way back. These institutions are too big to fail, and it was demented to allow derivative trading to end up the way it has ended up, and with the clearance risks that are embedded in the present system. And it's amazing how few people spoke against it as it was happening. There was just so much easy money to be reported. A lot of the money that was reported as being earned wasn't really being earned. It was in that wonderful category of assets that I call good until reached for. They sit there on the balance sheet, and when you reach for it, it just fades away like
He's not kidding.
mist.
He's not kidding.
We had 400 million of that good until reached for assets we got with General Re.
And they were behaving honorably.
Yes, but at any rate, people pushed it way too far. In the drug business, they say prove that this works before they certify the drug. On Wall Street, they start believing in the tooth fairy, and if one guy's reporting a lot of money, why, everybody else is asking, why aren't we betting on the tooth fairy? It's a crazy culture, and to some extent it's an evil culture, and it needs a huge reining in. And the accounting profession utterly failed us. The worst behaving were the people who set the accounting practice standards, and they're very bureaucratic and take forever, and they don't want to do anything real difficult that displeases people. This is not a combination of wonderful qualities when your job is to set accounting standards, which ought to be dealt with sort of like engineering standards. And they don't even have the right approach. So there's a lot wrong.